This book is the most remarkable piece of literature this world has ever seen. The Bible has outsold every other publication, been translated into more languages than any other. Some people were so committed to the concept of this being God's book that they were even willing to die for that proposition. At the hands of Nero, they were fed to the lions, where they were burned at the stake by Bloody Mary, Queen of England. Others used this same book as a justification for crusades that killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people. This is the story of how the Bible survived from the time of Moses until it reached the shores of America on the Mayflower.
After the death of Tyndale, the English Bible was considered a forbidden book. It would take a combination of political maneuvers to clear the way for an authorized English Bible. King Henry VIII was never a Protestant at heart. It was all an issue of political expediency. However, his new queen, Anne Boleyn, was a devoted believer in the Reformed movement. Her views were not covered in secrecy. She made efforts to exert influence on Secretary Cromwell to overlook the crimes of some caught smuggling Tyndale's New Testaments into England. In fact, she cordially received a specially bound copy of such a New Testament, sent to her while Tyndale was a prisoner at Bilbao, and today it is preserved in the British Museum. She appointed Matthew Parker, a noted reformer, to become chaplain to her daughter Elizabeth. Finally, Anne promoted another worthy reformer named Hugh Latimer to become the king's chaplain. It seemed that the Reformation had finally established a firm foundation that they could build upon. But the passions of the king turned once again, desire toward another lady at the court, Jane Seymour. These circumstances so troubled Anne that she gave premature birth to a stillborn son. One day in January of 1536, she walked into a room and unexpectedly found them in a compromising position. She had expected something to happen, but what and when?
A festival had been arranged in the city of Greenwich on May the 1st, 1536. It was going to be a gala occasion. The bleachers were filled with people waiting on joisters to entertain them. The king and queen was present. The queen accidentally dropped a handkerchief, and a man by the name of Henry Norris, one of the chief joisters, picked it up and he wiped his brow with it. The king took the occasion to leave the place in a rage. It was quite obvious that he was very disturbed, and that only caused anxiety with the queen. She didn't know what it was that disturbed him. She tried to find out, but without success. It wasn't until the next morning, when she saw Kingston, the lieutenant of the Tower, that she put the pieces together and realized what was happening and let out a scream. They brought her down on a barge from the River Thames to the Traitor's Gate in the entrance into the Tower, and they made her occupy the same suite of rooms that she did during the coronation ceremonies.
When Archbishop Cranmer heard of her arrest, he was stunned. he could not accept the charges brought against her. 3 gentlemen, including the young man who picked up her handkerchief, were interrogated, accused of acts of adultery with the Queen. Each in turn strongly denied the charges, but when one was put on the body rack, he quickly agreed to any statements they wished. They were all sentenced to death, including the Queen.
It was 11 o'clock in the morning on May the 19th that Anne quietly left her rooms, went into the courtyard of the tower behind me, put her head on a block of wood. It was a Frenchman that performed the ceremonies, he with his attendants, and as he had promised her, he severed her head with one blow of the axe. A cannon was shot from the tower to notify the king, who had been hunting in ground somewhere in the vicinity, to let him know that she was dead. It was November of 1527 when Bíbliuni was arrested, and at his trial in London, the metaphorical closet doors opened and the skeletons fell out. The first problem that he faced was caused by a man named Thomas Garrett. He was found black marketing 350 Bibles here into Cambridge, and that put all of Bíbliuni's friends under suspicion. In fact, it led to their arrest. That only compounded difficulties for John Frith, because in Oxford, a man by the name of John Clark was found reading his Bible in his own bedroom to several other students. That led to the arrest and suspicion of all the other friends of Bíbliuni that were in Oxford. And among the students that were arrested was John Frith.
The group were imprisoned in a cave beneath the college. Within 7 months, 4 of them had died because of the deplorable conditions. When they were released, they were commanded to carry faggots to the top of Carfax and burn a collection of forbidden books. Frith managed to escape this punishment and cross the English Channel to Antwerp. There he met Tyndale, and a close bond of friendship developed between them. While he was away from England, he wrote and published numerous manuscripts and demonstrated forceful logic. His knowledge of the Scripture and his forthright attacks on Roman doctrines were unanswerable. We are never told why, but Frith crossed the Channel back to England and was eventually taken to the Tower. 2 other secret reformers, Cromwell and Cranmer, held him as a prisoner of the Crown. It secured certain privileges and liberties. During this time, Frith conducted a debate from his cell through the printing presses with no less an enemy of the Reformation as Sir Thomas More, the Chancellor of England.
Refusing many opportunities and encouragements to escape, he was taken to St. Paul's Cathedral on June the 20th, 1533. He was tried, he was condemned, and he was relocated at the infamous Newgate prison, which is just behind me. It was while he was in the prison that he met a 24-year-old tailor by the name of Andrew Hewitt, and the 2 men, sentenced to the same punishment for the same crimes, became close friends. And on the 4th of July, 1533, they brought the 2 of them here to Smithfield. They chained them back to back with the stake between them, and they died. He had only just turned 30 years of age, and the spirit and body of John Frith parted company here in Smithfield.
Smithfield was to claim many more men and women who were devoted to the Reformation and their love for the English Bible. John Nicholson, referred to as Lambert, was put on trial for his doctrinal differences of the Lord's table. On November 16th in 1538, he was tried and convicted at Westminster Hall. 4 days later, he was burned at Smithfield. The winds were contrary. The fire was kept low, burning the lower legs to stubs. He had to hang to the chains. Soldiers became impatient and thrust lengthy spears into his side. By this time the hands were on fire. He held them out towards the people, and he shouted, "None but Christ, none but Christ." Although Tyndale had never finished the translation of the Old Testament, John Rogers picked up his pen and, using the alias of Thomas Matthews, finished the work. Then he sent the documents to a printer in England. The printer was so impressed with the work that he sent them to Archbishop Cranmer to see if he could get official approval. The Archbishop indirectly presented these documents to King Henry, and miraculously, he gave official approval for an English Bible to be printed in England for the very first time. With the exception of part of the Old Testament, this was really Tyndale's translation of the Bible. In fact, at the end of the book of Malachi, William Tyndale's initials are proudly displayed. This was only 3 years after Tyndale's final prayer, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." The footnotes in the Matthews Bible were strongly anti-Catholic, and this did not help foreign relations. Cromwell, the Secretary of State, decided that another Bible must be printed. Miles Coverdale softened the footnotes from the previous Bible, and in 1539 the Great Bible was finished. The Great Bible was but an edition of Tyndale's outlawed translation. Here it was on the streets, with absolute freedom, dressed in a new suit. A royal declaration was made. It was to be bought by every parish church in the land, and a time limit was given for the purchase. Once the time passed, the price doubled every month, until every church in England possessed a copy of the English Bible. It must be kept within access of the public, at any hour the public wished to read it. The church was also to provide a reader for those who were unable to read. The Bible was not a gift to the public by the church, but by the king. King Henry was central, and on either side of him stood Cranmer and Cromwell, by whom it was to be distributed through the priests to the people. This became the English Bible for the next 20 years. Though Tyndale's ashes lay scattered in a foreign land, without even a burial, if anything, this Bible should be his tombstone. The Great Bible was in every respect the fruit of his labor and the memorial of his life. Henry VIII was the husband of 6 wives, the lover of several concubines, and the father of many illegitimate children. Only 3 legitimate children survived infancy: Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. In 1546, Edward automatically became the heir of the throne at 9 years of age. The prevailing influence of his life was the Reformed faith. He was Protestant to the core, and the cause of the Reformers seemed firmly established. However, his health was poor, and after only 6 years on the throne, he died. The male line finished. The eldest daughter, Mary, inherited the throne.
She was as committed to the Catholic faith as her stepbrother had been to the Protestant faith. She believed that it was her right to conduct the Mass in her own private chapel, and if anybody made an issue of that, she appealed to her cousin, Charles V, and Charles V threatened to go to war on the issue of her religious freedom. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and her mind was crowded with the events of misfortune that befell her mother in her childhood. Because her mother's marriage was considered illegal, she was considered a bastard child, and at times she was required to be a lady-in-waiting to her younger half-sister Elizabeth. She was 20 years of age when her mother died, but they wouldn't allow her into the room to see her mother. They wouldn't give her a moment of quietness to be able to say goodbye to her mother. Her life was filled with harassment, and even with the threat of murder.
Mary displayed a gentle disposition at the beginning of her reign, but attitudes and pressures changed. Mary's religious zeal soon became evident, and a dark cloud fell on the Reformers' cause in England. She vowed vengeance on Archbishop Cranmer, who approved the divorce of her mother to Henry VIII, making her illegitimate, and changed England to a Protestant faith. Cranmer, along with Nicholas Ridley, the Bishop of London, and Latimer, were all arrested. Reading of the Bible was again banned in England, and the migration of people of the Reformed faith filled the free cities of Europe. But John Rogers, a prebendary of St. Paul's, was obstinate. He preached at St. Paul's on the true doctrine taught in King Edward's days. He warned his congregation against any reversal to pestilent popery, as he called it. 10 days later, he was arrested.
Many of the people who were awaiting their execution here in the city of London were kept at the Tower of London. But many of them were kept on this site behind me, which today is Old Bailey, the chief criminal court in Britain, but in that day was the infamous Newgate prison. It was just 9 days before Thomas Hooper was executed in Gloucester on the 4th of February 1555, that a man by the name of John Rogers was kept here and was walked down that street to Smithfield to be burned to death. You may remember the name of John Rogers because he was also known by the alias of Thomas Matthews. He was an assistant to William Tyndale, and he's the man that produced the Matthews Bible. That was only 18 years before this event. When he was taken from this prison down to Smithfield, there was a large company of people waiting to see him, and among them his wife and his children. And he was the father of many children, but he wasn't allowed to say a word to one of them. 6 days later, he had to face a committee appointed by Cardinal Pole, and Gardiner condemned him to die. The reason for his condemnation was that he refused to accept the Christian character of the Church of Rome and refused to accept that the elements of the Lord's Supper converted into the actual body and blood of Christ. It was February the 4th, 1555, when they brought him here to Smithfield to die by being burned to death. He was the first of 300 men who sacrificed their lives for that purpose during the reign of Bloody Mary. And Bradford, who was going to suffer the same judgment as he had, made a comment from his prison. He said he broke the ice valiantly.
Nicholas Ridley, Bishop of London, and Hugh Latimer were probably the English Reformation's most famous martyrs. Ridley was Archbishop Cranmer's chaplain. He strongly supported Cranmer's Protestant position. His theology of the Eucharist influenced the Book of Common Prayer. Hugh Latimer started as a zealous Catholic and it was Thomas Bíbliuni at Cambridge that was crucial in the conversion of this extraordinary preacher. Bíbliuni asked Latimer to hear his confession. For 2 hours in the confessional, Bíbliuni confessed his love for the Scriptures and the comfort and confidence that they brought to his heart. Latimer was moved to tears and became a powerful preacher of Protestantism. He was arrested during the end of Henry's reign for his objections to Catholic theology. However, when Edward ascended the throne, he was released.
It was 1553 when Bloody Mary came to the throne, and he was subpoenaed once again to appear before a tribunal at Westminster. He could have escaped this time and gone to the continent, but he decided not to. In 1554, he occupied a cell at the Tower of London, and 2 of his friends were in that cell with him, Ridley, the Bishop of London, and Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. They were then transferred here to the city of Oxford, and specifically to St. Mary's Church, where they were tried.
Both Latimer and Ridley were interrogated about the elements of the Lord's Supper that opposed Catholic theology, but they stood firm. Ridley, entering the place of execution first, held up both hands toward heaven. When he saw Latimer with a cheerful look, he ran to him and embraced him, saying, "Be of good heart, brother, for God will either assuage the fury of the flames or else strengthen us to abide it." Then both of them went to the stake and, kneeling down, prayed with great fervor.
After listening to a sermon that scathingly denounced them, they were chained to the stake and the timber was ignited. When the flames were coming up around him, the old man Latimer turned to his younger friend, and he said to him, "Master Ridley, play the man. We shall this day light a candle by God's grace in England that shall never be put out." The old man Latimer was 70 years of age when his lifeless body slumped over the chains above the dying embers. It was the indestructible book that changed his life. It comforted him in distress. He lived to preach it. And that same book changed all England.
Archbishop Cranmer was then ordered to stand trial. In 1556, he was degraded from office by a special Roman commission. It was designed to humiliate. His priestly tunic and stole were stripped from his body. A barber shaved his head. He'd been torturously worn down. The previous October, he had been forced to witness the horrific burnings of Latimer and Ridley. He finally faltered and wrote 5 recantations. Queen Mary and Cardinal Pole still maintained that they must be burned, but only after he made public declaration of his faith. It was raining on March the 21st, 1556, and they moved the formalities indoors to St. Mary's Church. Cole condemned his crimes and then called on Cranmer to make his public confession. But it wasn't until he reached the middle of his profession that he took a 180-degree turn. He said, "I renounce and refuse as things written with my hand contrary to the truth in my heart, and written for fear of death. And for as much as my hand offended in writing contrary to my heart, therefore my hand shall first be punished. For if I may come to the fire, it shall be first burned." As Cranmer went on to decry the Pope and the sacraments, Cole ordered Cranmer taken away. but they had a hard time keeping up with the old man as he rushed himself to the stake. He bade his friends farewell, and the fire was kindled at his feet. Cranmer stretched out his right hand into the flame and said, "This hand hath offended." Only once he withdrew it to wipe his face, and then he returned it until it burned to a stump. His last words were, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." He then collapsed and was consumed by the flame. 2 years later, and after 300 people had been burned to death, Bloody Mary died of poor health. On November the 17th, 1558, Elizabeth, her stepsister, ascended the throne. During her coronation, she was presented with the English Bible. She graciously received it, publicly kissed it, and promised to read it often. In 1559, she reenacted what her brother Edward VI had done before her, that one book of the whole Bible should be set up in every parish. While Bloody Mary was still on the throne, the reformers in Geneva employed their time by producing another translation of the Scriptures into English. It was completed in 1560 and was called the Geneva Bible. It was a unique Bible in that it was the first produced by a group or committee rather than by an individual. The group included John Knox, Miles Coverdale, William Withingham, and other lesser-known authorities. These men had access to John Calvin when they needed important input. Their source of material was greater than any afforded to a previous translator. They painstakingly worked on every minute detail. This method of translation was later adopted by the committees who worked on the King James Version. Though it was never sanctioned for public use in England, it quickly became the household Bible because of its convenient size. It was particularly the Puritans' Bible and became the Bible of the Commonwealth Army. In 1559, Elizabeth, now reigning queen, appointed Matthew Parker as the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was the master of Corpus Christi College in Cambridge. At his insistence, a new English Bible was needed. It has been called the fourth revision of the Tyndale translation. It was also the result of a committee, this time of 8 or 9 bishops. This became known as the Bishop's Bible.
His Bible was really needed, so he believed, because of the growing influence of the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible was actually causing 2 problems. In the first place, it was replacing the authority of the Authorized Version, which was the great Bible in that day. In the second place, it was really undermining the authority of the bishops. Now, when Queen Elizabeth ascended the throne and the reformers came back from under the influence of John Calvin, a movement known as Puritanism began in England. That movement for Puritanism fostered another movement. That movement was toward nonconformity. Once they started stressing purity, and they were asking for purity in the lives of the clergy, that really focused on the bishops of that time. The end result of it was there was really an investigation to try and find a new form of church administration.
The movement alarmed Archbishop Parker because it threatened to undermine the respect that people would show to the clergy. He felt this new translation would re-establish their prestige. While they followed the Great Bible in the historical sections, the prophetical books carried the distinct influence of the Geneva Bible. It was costly and cumbersome. Its ecclesiastical terms were unsuited to the average man. The Bishop's Bible survived for 40 years and 20 editions. It was considered the weakest of all the Reformation Bibles. At the death of Elizabeth, a childless queen, James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, became the next heir to the throne of England. Unlike his mother, he was brought up with strong Protestant convictions. Scotland, reformed by John Knox, was Presbyterian to the core. So before he ever arrived in London, James was met by a party who presented him with the millenary petition.
This was a request signed by 800 Puritan clergymen, and they were asking the king to remove certain religious rituals, such as the signing of the cross at baptism. And that caused James II to call for an investigation into those things pretending to be amiss within the church. And the meeting was held here at Hampton Court in 1604.
On the third day of these meetings, Dr. John Reynolds, the leader of the Puritan group, argued that the existence of the Bishop's Bible was an acknowledgement to the inferiority of other translations when compared to the Geneva edition. His logic was invincible. Either make the Geneva the authorized version, or set about the task of creating a better translation. The latter suggestion appealed to the king's vanity. And so on July 22nd in 1604, the king announced the appointment of 54 men to work under the guidance of Richard Bancroft, the Bishop of London. It took another 3 years before the work was started, and there were 47 translators named. They were then divided between the 3 academic centres of England, Oxford, Cambridge, and Westminster, 2 committees meeting at each location. The books were divided, and each man made his own translation. He then passed it along to the other members of his group for approval. They then submitted their section to each of the other 5 committees. When it had been amended, it was sent to the select committee of the best 12 scholars, and they agreed on the final revision. This was the greatest translation to date. It was the work of the greatest minds of that generation. The knowledge of Greek and Hebrew had greatly increased. And finally, Shakespeare, Spencer, Marlowe, and others had elevated literary taste through a new literary style. This book, therefore, was considered to be the greatest masterpiece of English literature, unparalleled by preceding or even succeeding generations. It was destined to become the best-selling book of all time. In 1580, a young man by the name of William Brewster was attending Peterhouse College in Cambridge. Though Brewster was unable to determine the goals of his academic pursuit, he was exposed to and adopted the doctrine of the Puritans. He was to play a crucial role in the founding of a brand new colony and eventually a nation. Brewster befriended another young man by the name of William Bradford. In 1602, they started walking 12 miles to Gainsborough to worship at the Separatist Church. The church had just called John Smythe, a Cambridge-educated man, as their pastor. This assembly considered themselves a separate and independent institution, accountable to none but its own congregation. For this stand they were persecuted protected by the state. And by 1606, Smythe the pastor and several of his congregation were obliged to flee into exile. They escaped to Amsterdam, where Smythe became a physician. During this time in history, Holland had a reputation for religious tolerance that attracted many persecuted religious groups. Brewster invited the members who remained to his manor in Scobie, England, and he became their spiritual advisor. Among those that joined this underground church was John Robinson. He was a minister from Norwich and had to flee from there for his own safety. This subjected Brewster's assembly to suspicion and persecution. Many members lost their property, paid heavy fines, and suffered stiff prison sentences. It soon became apparent that freedom of worship would necessitate their exile also.
I'm standing here by Fishtoft, about 4 or 5 miles from Boston, on marshy, soggy ground, where the Pilgrim Fathers met back in September of 1607. It wasn't a simple thing to migrate from England in those days. There was a law on the books known as Statute 13, Richard II, that made it illegal for a person to leave England without a permit. And what compounded the problem for these people was that on the 15th of that month, a warrant had been issued for the arrest of William Brewster, but the authorities were just not able to find him.
The group negotiated with a Dutch captain to meet them in the marshy waters at Fishtoft. After the Puritans had loaded their goods and their families, waiting for the tide to rise, they were surrounded by the sheriff's officials. The men were robbed, the women immodestly searched, and brought back to the city of Boston.
When they were brought into the city of Boston, the majority of them were detained in another area. But 7 of them that were considered ringleaders were brought here to the Guildhall, and they were kept in these 2 cells. There's a board or a bench that's against the wall at this side and at that side, and it's the same in the other cell. And the 7 men were kept in these quarters. A stairway beside me leads up into the courtroom where they were tried. I think they were very kindly treated, because John Cotton was the minister of the local church, and John Cotton's the name of the man that led a migration to the new land in 1630, only 10 years after the Pilgrim Fathers went. So the town people were sympathetic to the Pilgrims. They were kept here for 1 month. Then they were released to be taken to a tribunal in Lincoln, at which they were released on their own recognizance. But by the time that William Brewster arrived back at Scobie Manor, he had nothing left. He had lost everything in this venture.
We don't know how long they were imprisoned, but we do know that they made another attempt to migrate out of England. In 1608, they finally arrived in Amsterdam. Joining the group who had migrated before them, they now numbered about 100. All of them had left a farming life and were now forced to compete in a world of trade. They were plain folks, utterly honest, hard workers and conscientious to a fault. The readjustment in their lives had to be accomplished through a foreign language. This is the actual church where they used to worship while they were in Amsterdam. After about a year, they appealed to the city of Leiden, about 35 miles south, for permission to live in that city. Permission granted, they relocated in Leiden for the next 11 years and were exemplary in character. They grew to about 300. This is the same church where they used to worship while they were in Leiden. The pastor became an honorable member of the university. Their products were used by other tradesmen, and they were given credit when it was needed. In fact, travelling English tradesmen such as Edward Winslow and Miles Standish cast their lots with them. In the course of time, it became obvious that they had to move once more. There were many factors. It was difficult to make a living in this new market. The children were joining the Netherlands army, and some were submitting to the temptations of the city. Also, because they were a minority, conditions threatened to absorb them into the community, and they were much too patriotic to permit that to happen. Finally, persecution was beginning to reach them. 2 books that the Pilgrims had written had reached England, and James I wanted them brought to justice. All of these conditions related to the destiny of their next move, and several options were discarded in favor of a new home in the colonies. A group of 70 London merchants came up with a proposal which the Pilgrims finally accepted. They had claims to a tract of land obtained from the London Company with a right to self-government. A contingency from England were to join the Leiden group, and they were to cross the Atlantic in 2 vessels, a 60-ton pinnace called the Speedwell and a 180-ton known as the Mayflower. It was from this very canal that the Pilgrims boarded the Speedwell to begin their journey to the new land. They were to rendezvous with the English contingent at Southampton before facing the Atlantic. The journey to the New World began on August the 5th in 1620. There were 30 passengers on the Speedwell and 90 on the Mayflower. After battling contrary winds for 3 days, the Speedwell sprung a leak and had to pull into Dartmouth for repairs. Completely overhauled, they put out to sea the second time. By this time, the 2 vessels had gone 300 miles on the other side of Land's End, and the Speedwell sprung another serious leak. The both vessels had to turn back to the closest port they could find, which was Plymouth. And by that time, there were 18 passengers on the Speedwell who decided that they didn't want to migrate to the new land. That left 102 passengers, and they decided they would crowd onto the Mayflower and take their chances. Those Pilgrims were very familiar with the perils of trying to cross the Atlantic Ocean. There were 180 of them from the Amsterdam Church that migrated to Virginia in March of 1619, but only 50 of them arrived at their destination. Overcrowding and disease took a heavy toll on life. The first part of the journey was uneventful, until gales with a terrific force battered their vessel. One storm followed another. One person died, but a baby was born. This enabled the same number to arrive as had left the port in England. It was after 9 weeks on the open seas that they finally sighted land. It was on November the 9th, and they became somewhat concerned when they found out that it wasn't under the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company. That concern drove them to draw up that familiar and famous Mayflower Compact. There were 41 of the men that signed that contract. They believed that they did it here in this room, the main cabin of Master Christopher Jones. The Mayflower sat off the coast, while 2 separate expeditions set out to find a harbor. Outside of a brief encounter with Indians, they were greatly encouraged with the country, but they were unable to find fresh water or a suitable harbor. It was December the 6th when the 3rd expedition set out. They went out in a little boat similar to the one behind me known as the Shallop, and they came to land.
They found varied cornfields and little brooks, and then they returned to the Mayflower. But there was also good news awaiting them, because the Mayflower, that until that time was positioned out in Cape Cod Bay, was now able to come into the Plymouth Harbor, and 27 days of expedition had finally brought the voyage to a close.
You may find it curious, but the Bible that the Pilgrims brought to this new land was not the King James Version. Because of their strong Puritan beliefs, they preferred the Geneva edition. It was from the words of this Bible that they got their resolve and their strength. The greatest adversity that they were ever going to face lay directly ahead of them. The Bible was their only sure foundation in their great time of need. It was December 28th when they finally decided on an exact location for the settlement. They immediately started building barricades. A street was plotted parallel to a stream. The avenue leading from the rock had been named Leyden Street.
Because of the severity of the winter, the delays caused by the speedwell, and the fierceness of the storms they faced on the Atlantic when they were coming across the water, they came here totally unprepared for what lay ahead of them. The months of January and February were particularly heavy. It said that by the end of February, 31 of them had died, mostly women. When they died, they waited until nightfall. Then they took their bodies here to Coves Hill, overlooking Plymouth Harbor, and they buried them, leveled off the graves, and planted on top of it, particularly concerned about what the Indians would think. Sickness was so severe among them that they had taken the first house they built and converted it into a hospital, and they still faced problems because there were more people that were sick than were well able to tend to their needs. It's reported that by the end of January, 1/2 of the Pilgrims died and were buried here at Coles Hill.
By the middle of March, the warm sun indicated their first severe winter was past. The Indians were greatly feared, and Miles Standish organized a militia and situated 5 cannons on Fort Hill platform. Then one morning, near the end of March, another startling event occurred.
They were about to hold a meeting in their common house when an Indian came walking down the middle of the road, and he greeted them with a hearty welcome in English. He was going to go into the house when they stopped him until they found out more about him. They found out that his name was Samson, and he yielded to them a wealth of information.
The following Thursday, he introduced them to Squanto. Squanto was fluent in English. He was one of 24 natives who had been kidnapped and sold as slaves in Spain. He had escaped to England and eventually returned to the area only to discover that he was the sole survivor of his tribe. Squanto, in turn, introduced the Pilgrims to another native leader by the name of Massasoit, who brought 60 of his men with him. The result was that a peace pact was organized between them that lasted for the next 50 years. On April 5th, 1621, the Mayflower hoisted her sails and set out once more for the open seas. This was the last link that bound the Pilgrims to England, and they watched its upper sails disappear into the horizon of water.
These brave and courageous Pilgrims in the government of circumstance became the seeds of a new nation. It must be remembered they were humans made of flesh and blood like we are. They sacrificed fortunes, they suffered privations, they endured hardships, but for one supreme purpose. They wanted the freedom to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience. And it must be remembered
They prized that liberty above life itself, and all the obstacles that were placed in their way to prevent the accomplishment, they overcame. While we pay tribute to these great men, the forefathers of this nation, we ought to pause for a moment and pay tribute to the source of their strength, the place where they found comfort in sorrow, to the magnet that drew them across 3,000 miles of churning, tempestuous, cold Atlantic waters beyond the edge of civilization. The source of that strength was a book, the Bible. They held it supreme in all matters of faith and practice. And that Bible we know as the indestructible book.